Thank you so much, Matt, and a huge thank you to Gatorade because they brought me here today. So thank you to them. And also I want to acknowledge Nick Clayton from NSCA. I hope you all know him. But Nick helped me develop these questions. So, you know, obviously the NSCA board and staff, they're very in touch with the members, which I really appreciate, and they're here and they communicate with you. And so he helped me develop these questions based on what personal trainers have said to him, the questions that they want answered. So, again, this is the top 5 nutrition questions, and within each one I have a number of different variables. So calories or macros, this one comes up all the time. Which one is best? And I'll cover each question from both a research perspective and what's actually practical. Counting calories, carbohydrates, is it necessary to cut them? Periodizing diet based on training, and then tracking. Next, I'll look at metabolic compensation, so avoiding weight loss plateaus, calories absorbed from food, the low-fat, full-fat question, both from a weight perspective and then also weight satiety perspective and then health perspective. Sugar-free meals, snacks, empty stomach, training on an empty stomach. Weight gain, I'll cover this a little bit because our next speaker, Joey Antonio, will go through this quite a bit. Supplements, and then 2 changes that you can get your clients to do right away that are pretty easy to incorporate compared to some of the diet changes. So first, calories or macros. How many of you get this question all the time? And how many people have clients that actually follow macros? 1, are they fitness and figure clients? Yes. So here's what the research says on calories and macros. There's really not a ton of research on this subject. And the interesting thing is you can adjust your calories. So if you have somebody counting calories, whatever method they're choosing, whether they're using an app, pen and paper, calculator, etc., you can add a macro component in there. There's no one best method for individuals. And in fact, if you look through weight loss study after weight loss study, the number 1 factor is adherence. So I approach this as, hey, we don't know which one's better. You can adjust calories to include macros. I'll talk about that in a second. But approach it, look at your client and go, you know what are they actually going to do? Because a lot of times they don't follow, they fall off track with tracking, etc. So calories, it's pretty conceptually easy, right? Counting calories using MyFitnessPal, MyFatSecret, pen and paper. I've got a lot of people that still like to do that. Calories, we know it's the most important factor for weight loss. You have to be in that caloric deficit. Throughout this presentation, though, I'll talk about some factors that help people get in that calorie deficit and also the macronutrient makeup. Whenever you're decreasing calorie content, you've got to up that protein. We know from many studies that the lower the calorie deficit, you have to increase protein even more to spare muscle tissue. So for instance, and I've just had a client like this whose parent put her on a 750 calorie diet on off days, and then on training days, and we're talking very high intensity exercise training, she's about 18 or 19, 1,200 calories, and he wanted her to get about 200 grams of protein. I'm like, there's no way. It's not possible, right? So, but we have to. The lower the calorie deficit, the more protein you need. A general guideline is about above 2 grams, 2 to 2.4 grams per day for weight loss clients. Increase their protein intake. Pretty easy to do. You can give them that. You can give them calories and protein, and that's it, if that's all that they can handle. For those that do macros, I think the best way to do this is probably through either Excel spreadsheets or possibly those tracking programs, which I'll also talk about in a second. But the macro content, I feel as if you can either give them a set amount and they can record it and give it back to you, and you can, obviously check it for adherence, or you can give them, carbs, protein, and then they can adjust their carbs based on the training program. We'll talk about that. So calories or macros, again, I always say go with whatever's easiest and know your clients. I had a client a few years ago, a football player. He had to lose weight for the NFL Combine. I had roughly about 6 weeks to get him in shape. And I just gave him carbohydrates. I'm like, you know, he's 347 pounds. He'll meet his protein needs. I'm not worried about that. And I actually used that carbohydrate cutting approach because it was the easiest thing to do. I gave him a lot of packaged foods. I know some dietitians would croak at this, but I'm like, I've got to get him to where he needs to be. This is easy. He can look on the back of the package and go, okay, she said a maximum of 60 grams of carbohydrate per meal, this many meals per day. Simple, right? I know he's automatically going to cut his calories doing this. You don't need to cut calories. Again, I'll talk about that in a minute, but it was an easy approach. And packaged food was simple versus every single time he went to a restaurant, he'd call me and go, wait a minute, how much did you say? What size of my fist? What size of my cell phone? So, you know, I had to remind him. But he lost a ton of weight, 20 pounds in 5 weeks. Agent was happy. After that, we had to transition into a more realistic program, adding some carbohydrate back. Still a bit of a struggle. He's about 325 now, I think. But it's still a weight loss struggle. So the other thing, important point about calories and macros, they're all estimates, right? The food label is not exact. It's not like you're going to pick something up and go, oh, it's exactly 230 calories, right? If the manufacturer is actually following guidelines, it could be up to 20% higher. So if you put a male on a 2,000 calorie diet, he may be eating 2,400 calories or so. And there are many foods that don't meet this because there's nobody going around in our government going around and going, okay, let me measure this food to make sure that it's meeting label claim. So some manufacturers do come under fire at some point because somebody finds out, an independent lab, and they're not actually meeting the amount of calories. Calories burned, this isn't concrete math either, right? According to the research, and I searched through some of Kevin Hall's papers. He's a scientist at NIH that does quite a bit of studies on metabolic compensation, calories, macronutrient profiles, and you know, according to some of his research and the research he collected, we can't measure this with 5% or less precision. And when we're using equations, we're really kind of guessing. I get that. And when we're looking at exercise, we're guessing. So how many people use Harris-Benedict, Cunningham, all those equations? We all use them, right? Anyone else? You all don't use them? Do your clients ask for calorie amounts? Some do, some don't. Okay. I have to use them, but in estimate physical activity, of course, but I don't know what they're doing at home. I don't know if they go home, if they sit, if that's, you know, if they go home and they're active all day. So all of this is an estimate at best. And it's interesting, I had a colleague a few years ago on a listserv. She was talking about this weight gain case, and she calculated everything out, and she goes, oh, I've got it. You know, it was the 1 tablespoon of extra 35-calorie cream that made this person gain 5 pounds in a year. And I thought, how is that like, you can't measure any of this with precision. What if the person walked a couple flights of stairs and burned it off, right? So the bottom line here with calories and macros, I think they're both a little bit, you know, it takes obviously someone following up, and I think also it takes somebody else like you asking for, you know, to check in regularly with the client and actually see it, for them to stick with it. So what about cutting carbs? I mentioned that this isn't necessary, right? I do sometimes use it. Study after study shows that in the first 3 to 6 months, you will lose more weight cutting carbohydrate than if you go on a higher carbohydrate, low-fat diet. And we know that people who lose more weight in the first few months, they're more likely to adhere, and they're more likely to get better success over time. And all of this makes sense, right? If your client's actually getting results, they're going to stick with what you're telling them. And if they like your training program, they're going to keep coming back. So I'm a big fan of taking all the tools that you have and all of those dietary approaches, starting with one, adjusting it as necessary. So let them go on a little bit lower carbohydrate diet for a while, or you can even cut the eating time off at 7 p.m. or something like that, just so they don't snack at night, and then slowly add them back so that they will get some of that initial success, even if some of it's water weight, and then change over time. But here's what the research really says about low carb. All of them, low carb, higher fat, higher protein, high carbohydrate diets, they all produce the same results over time. I will say some of these studies, or many of them, didn't actually look at body fat. So, some of the people may have also lost some muscle. If you go on a low carbohydrate diet, the number one thing is your clients won't be able to exercise intensely. Does anyone here have clients on a low carb diet right now? What's that? That's odd. No one. I know. Crazy. But here's the theory behind this. So we know that carbohydrates one of the number one promoters of insulin. That's a storage hormone that helps our body store fat and blunts the breakdown of fat. Gary Taubes, many other people, they promoted this diet as a method for weight loss. And in fact, they focused on that one part of metabolism only. It's like, okay, it's insulin and it's carbohydrates. That's what's making everybody fat. The problem is you could throw this out now, throw that in the trash. Kevin Hall, in addition to other studies, Kevin Hall this past summer published one where they had clients in a metabolic ward, so a very controlled study. 19 obese adults, it was a crossover study, so each one got a different diet. They followed dietary carb or fat restriction by 6 days, and then they had a 5-day washout period, and then they switched groups. And in this particular study, restricting fat intake led to greater fat loss compared to restricting dietary carbohydrate. So if you read the study and if you look at some of the media reports, he'll say that this really throws out that theory of carbohydrate and insulin as that primary factor that leads to weight gain. Like, that's not what is causing America to be obese. And people may decrease their ad lib calorie intake. That is one thing if they restrict carbohydrate. Those are the foods that we tend to overeat. In another study, this one was published this spring, and this is a fantastic model for weight loss. The only problem is it's really, really tough to stick to over time. So this is one of those ones where if you have those gung-ho clients, and I know with all the experience in this room, you can kind of judge somebody. It's that personal interaction where you can judge them and work with them and see how far you can push them and how much they're willing to do. So in this study, this was done by folks at McMaster University. They had young recreationally active men. They put them on a very intense 4-week diet and exercise program with a 40% calorie deficit. That's tough. That's tough to stick with if anyone's ever done it. The kicker here is all meals were prepared for them. And this is one of the things that makes some of these studies most successful. Metabolic ward, obviously, number one. Number two, the meals are prepared and they're measured. As personal trainers, you can always recommend a meal program. There are tons of them out there, and there's some ones that are nationwide as well as some ones in each city. They gave them 1 or 2 diet groups and then put them on a very high-intensity training program. So a combination of resistance training, high-intensity interval training, and then a little bit of steady-state cardio as well. And here are the different groups. So each one had a total calorie intake of about 15 calories per pound of lean mass. The difference between the high and the low protein group was 35% of calories versus 15. And 15, as you know, it's funny, this is called low calorie in the study because this is what Americans eat, number one. It's what the guidelines say to eat, the dietary recommendations. And what's been shown over time is that people have a tough time increasing their protein intake to a greater percentage of calories. And so this equaled out to about 1.09 grams or 2.4 grams per protein per kg. And then in the low protein group, it was 1.2 grams, considerably higher, 1.5 times higher than the dietary recommendations at this time. 4 weeks later, and this is astounding for a 4-week diet program, right? Almost 11 pounds of weight loss, fat loss. and they gain lean mass while cutting their calorie intake 40%. That's huge. The moderate protein group, they had a slight lean mass gain. That's pretty impressive, actually, and 7.7 pounds of fat loss. So what this tells me is, again, we need that higher level of protein above 2 grams per kilogram body weight while cutting calories to preserve muscle. And you can actually gain lean mass while on a lower calorie diet. It's possible. This is a great model. Like I said, it's just one of those ones that needs to be transitioned over time. Do something a little bit more sustainable. So again, it's not necessary to cut carbohydrates. And in fact, if your clients do cut carbohydrates, we know that they won't be able to sustain that high intensity exercise. So they won't get the most from your training program. They won't be able to burn as many calories, build muscle, etc. So instead of cutting carbs, here's what I recommend. Age-old approach. There's nothing incredibly exciting about this, but focus on the type of carbohydrates. Cutting down on some of these refined, high added sugar carbohydrates. What we're learning from some of the more recent research is there is a difference. Overall calories that's very important, right? But there's a difference. The more refined the food is, it seems as if, from certain studies, and I'll go through those in a minute, it seems as if it's easier to actually absorb the calories. The other thing is, we're getting about half the fiber we need each day for good health, and we know that this diet, that high refined fiber, or high refined sugar, high refined carbohydrates, low fiber diet, alters our gut bacteria in such a way, and this is emerging research, that there are differences in obese people and lean people in their gut bacteria. And it seems as if that bacteria plays a role in overall body weight. So it's something we're learning, and it's a factor that may help contribute to lower body weight. So what about periodizing based on training? And this is one of those questions that personal trainers are getting, and I realize that. And my thought here is, being practical about it, how many clients actually weigh and measure their food? How many people have clients that weigh and measure everything? Are they fitness figure clients or just weight loss? Weight loss? Okay. What's that? OCD component, okay. Yeah, those are the only clients that I know that weigh or measure as well. So this is a really tough thing to implement. I can periodize based on training if I have a chef and the chef can take directions, or if I have one of those meal delivery services. Otherwise, the only way I periodize is when they're with me and when they're training. It's a matter of, okay, you're going to eat this before, you're going to eat this during training. If they're training for several hours, you're going to eat this after. Eat your regular diet if I have weight gain, but here's how I'm going to add 1,000 calories, or I'll give them specific instructions on where to add calories. With taking away calories, sometimes I'll use that nighttime approach. It doesn't matter when you eat, but cutting off their food intake at a certain time helps some people because that means they just stop eating garbage. So it's that, okay, this person told me to do this, I'm going to follow this. I'll try to periodize calories based on where they are or if they take time off from training. Again, it's a tough thing. Carbohydrates, I'll work with carbohydrate needs to cut those as needed. So if the volume of training goes down, we're talking, okay, you normally eat this for breakfast. Let's cut out that one extra piece of bread. Let's cut out this at lunch. And at dinner time, start with that salad that really fills you up. And instead of having 2 fistfuls of rice or potatoes, can you go to 1.5 or 1? So it's very, very easy instructions to help that they can implement, versus knowing that unless they're OCD, they're not going to sit there and weigh and measure everything. They're not going to take out their measuring cups over time. The other thing I will do is, if they're on a low-calorie diet for a long period of time, I'll up their calorie intake a day or 2 a week. And I think there's some research probably coming out about this soon, from what I've been told, at least by a couple professors. But because we know over time, and some of this research years ago done in Curves patients and even before that, and I'll cover one or 2 of the studies, but if they cut their calorie intake over time, like the girl that I told you that is on that 750 to 1250 calorie diet, her metabolism's slowing. There's no way she's not compensating, right? Unless she's binge eating here and there. So I'll add calories back. I'll add a higher calorie day or two, hopefully to prevent that. But I also try to minimize how much they're cutting calories because we know that training's going to suffer, metabolism is going to slow. So what about tracking calories? Anyone have, who has clients that do this? How do the rest of you, how do your clients, do they even look at food intake? Do they track? Some. There is no one best method from research studies. Again, I always, whatever's easiest. I had one athlete who would take pictures and send them to me. And so we'd go back and forth with pictures. MyFitnessPal and MyFatSecret, I have other clients that just use pen and paper. The problem is people do not stick with this. We know from research study after research study, the most successful losers, those that are in the National Weight Loss Registry and those that, if we do dietary surveys, who's lost weight, who's kept it off, they track, especially ones that were, obese for years. They have to have something to keep them accountable, and this keeps them accountable. But not many people stick on it. So the best way I've ever heard is actually from a personal trainer in the back of the room who gets his clients to stick on it. And what he does is he incentivizes them by having them pay ahead of time. We know if you pay, right, you're going to stick with something. It's more valuable than if you sit there and give free advice as a personal trainer, right? If you're just giving diet advice here and there versus adding a diet component to your program that costs money, if they have to give something, people are more likely going to stick with it. So that was the best advice I ever heard. And the only other thing I've seen that keeps people sticking to this, unless of course they're OCD, or if they have that long-term history, is if they have an event to plan for. They'll log for a while, they stop logging, and then they'll log again for a while. And that's their pattern. Another thing I've found out, especially for overweight and obese individuals, is they fear being judged. So they don't want to put everything in. And I'll look at their diet record and go, there's no way this person's eating 1,200 calories, right? But they don't want to put those binge episodes in. They don't want to put the drinking in. So I always approach it as, you know what, I've got to have all of this information. You need to have it. You don't even have to show it to me if you don't want. Just track. And then there's this huge relief. Like, they don't have to show it to me. They're not going to be judged. They can just see it themselves. That's step number one. And then when they're comfortable, I'll let them show it to me. Because, again, they're not going to put everything in there if they think that you're going to hammer down on them. Like I said, you could make it mandatory. The problem with that is some people at the very last minute, they're going to be filling stuff in and going back in days and, oh, my trainer wants to see this. That could happen. Again, use that non-judgmental approach. I always say progress, not perfection. There's nobody in here that eats a 100% healthy, perfect diet 24/7. Even figure fitness models, etc., once their competition is over, they're regular people. They add some of those favorite foods. And when people hear that, they think, oh my gosh, like, you actually don't eat, chicken, brown rice, broccoli, etc., those foods 24/7. No, nobody does that. And then accountability, knowing that you're there, knowing that you're their coach. And again, I like that incentive approach. So if they give something to you, if they have something at stake, if they're not as internally motivated, that incentive will help them lose some weight so they gain that motivation over time. Here are the traits of success from a number of different studies, okay? Based on research, and again, it's what your clients are willing to do. Meal planning. Huge trait of success. I can get around this because either using chefs, I have some athletes that use chefs, or I do those meal planning services. Even if you're in a small town, there are plenty that deliver on ice. This is a great way. They don't have to weigh, measure, think about it. Accountability. Many people who are successful losers actually weigh every single day. And this is something that I hear over and over from my colleagues, like, oh my gosh, they shouldn't weigh every day. They're going to have body dysmorphia disorder. Well, if it keeps them on track and they went from 500 pounds to 300 pounds, I say go ahead and weigh every day. Tracking, that's a component of success. Successful losers are much more likely to track than not track. Successful losers are more likely to lift weights. They incorporate resistance training versus just aerobics. And it's interesting, this is something that I feel like a lot of females are a little bit resistant to do, because it's, oh my gosh, I've got to spend 2 hours on the Stairmaster to lose the weight. And then the other really successful trait is they have that mindset and they feel like they can do it, and they don't have all those barriers. They don't sit there and say, oh, it's time, I can't stick with it, this training program is too hard, I can't cook. So it's those people who are more optimistic and less likely to let all those little barriers of life get in their way. That's huge. So just to review calories and macros, best option, research-wise, we don't know. Whatever your client will do, I think is the best approach. You don't have to do you don't even have to count anything. You can give them portions based on size of their hands, size of their cell phone. I do this all the time. When you go to lunch, eat the size of your cell phone or your hand like this in chicken, turkey, red meat, etc. Low carb, I use this approach even though it's not grounded in research, except for the fact that you can get initial weight loss. Some of it's water weight, but again, if it helps them adhere, if it helps them get excited about it, I'm going to use it. Have a transition plan. Emerging research, we don't know a whole lot about this, is looking at genetics. In fact, I just did quite a few blood samples and some other different markers. Mayo Clinic is looking at different markers that we have to determine potentially what diet is best for everyone. This is going to be super exciting. And the macronutrient content, we're not there yet. Here's what I'm going to guess though. They're going to look at everybody's, research, the samples that we gave, and it was stool, blood, saliva, and they're going to come back, and I bet money that they're going to, like each person's diet in this particular study is going to be similar to what they habitually eat. Because if we look at different clients, I've got clients that they do really well on high protein, higher fat, and they're used to it. Add some carbohydrates, they feel a little bit sluggish. So I might add enough so they feel better during high intensity exercise, but I'm not going to drastically switch their diet. And then you have others that super high carbohydrate diet, and that's their food preference. That's what they do well on. So that's my guess for that. Research, it's going to be probably a few years before we can make concrete suggestions based on it. Tracking works if they'll do it. It's a great tool, again, if they'll stick with it. And they have to believe. So how do you maximize weight loss and avoid plateaus? Metabolic compensation, right? This always happens. Anytime your client loses weight, their calorie level will go down. In government document after government document, and in school, I think many of us learned that, let's just take out our calculator. If we decrease 3,500 calories, that's a pound. If we increase it, that's a pound. This is not simple math. Again, we don't know exactly calories burned. We can't exactly add up calories consumed, especially outside of a lab and free-living humans. But the other problem with this math equation is that your resting metabolic weight rate will drop once you lose weight, right? It makes sense. You carry around a smaller body, you don't need as many calories each day for daily activity. Calories burned during exercise also drops as a person loses weight. One of the older but still great studies, here's what they found, and I've seen many studies since this time that are approximately same. So non-obese and obese people, after 10% weight loss, their resting energy expenditure in both, they dropped about 3 to 4 calories per kilogram fat-free mass. So no difference between lean and obese people. Their total energy expenditure dropped about 6 in the non-obese and about 8 in the obese. So that's where, it did drop a little more. And is that just, hey, I've lost some weight, I don't feel like doing as much? But it does decrease. And then with weight gain, we know our calorie, our calorie needs, our resting metabolic rate, everything goes up, even if it's fat. Like I always say, I had a girl I worked with one time, she goes, well, how is that? How is that person's, she's so much bigger, she doesn't do exercise, how is her resting metabolic rate higher than mine? How does she have more lean mass? And I'm like, well, even if you're blow drying your hair, if your arm's bigger, that's resistance training. Every day you're lifting weight, right? So you're building muscle, you're burning calories. So metabolic compensation happens. The biggest thing I can say is talk to each of your clients and prepare them for this, that you can't go back to your regular diet, right? You're going to have to adjust downward and then creep up a little bit in calories to see where you can maintain weight, or creep up in food portions to see where you can maintain. So avoiding weight loss plateaus, always above 2 grams per kg body weight protein. This can be tough, especially for females. Keep calorie deficit as low as possible to avoid a sharp drop. Periodize calories if they get this precise, or just tell them, don't have a binge day, but go up in calories this day, or go up in calories, go out to dinner one day a week. Enjoy life a little bit. Higher calorie day or two. Also along those meal patterns, I'm sure many of you have seen these slides over and over, but research from UT Galveston has shown that if you have a skewed pattern, that's on the right over here, if you have a skewed pattern of protein intake, 10, 16, 63, and Joey goes, who eats 10 grams of protein at breakfast? And I said, my mom. Cereal and milk, right? A lot of clients, a lot of people, especially females, are not likely to get much at breakfast, much at lunch. They diet during the day, and then at dinner they're starved. But what they found is that even pattern is probably better for muscle growth and keeping muscle on, so attenuating that loss of muscle as we get older. Now, for certain people, for men, I find this is easy. Get enough calories at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you'll get your protein. But it's the women that, historically the patterns I find are off. So again, it could be just something simple like cereal and milk, and then a salad with a little bit of protein. Any fast food or quick serve salad, they got a little teeny bit of protein in there. So they equated this to about a 1% loss of muscle mass over time. And these are short-term studies. We don't know how these will play out over a long period of time. I suspect that this pattern matters a lot more in people who do not meet their protein needs every single day. So someone who falls short on protein, the pattern probably matters more than if you have, say, somebody that's getting that 2.4 grams per kilogram body weight. And then this is what my mom says all the time, how on earth could I eat 30 grams of protein at breakfast, right? You could have clients add like branched chain amino acids. We know that if you add those to a protein poor meal, that'll temporarily increase muscle protein synthesis. That'll increase the deposition of protein and muscle. Over time, this is not as successful as having a higher protein meal and meeting your protein needs each day. So again, that is probably better for people who really just cannot get that, but I advocate for a higher protein. I'm going to skip that slide. Calorie estimates and absorption. This is another thing that I find, instead of just always talking about calories and tracking and all this stuff, move your clients toward better food. This is the easiest way to maintain long-term weight, right? Once they start changing what they actually will eat and learning to eat new, healthier foods, it's easier to keep the weight off, right? It's easier to do it on fruits, vegetables, lean proteins than it is on donuts and fried foods. Some of the research, and there aren't tons of studies on this in a variety of different foods, but in nuts in particular, almonds, walnuts, pistachios, you actually absorb fewer calories if you eat the whole nut than if you eat a nut butter. So even though, it says 170 calories a cup for almonds, you don't absorb that many. Walnuts, same thing. Pistachios, you absorb just about 5% less. And scientists think it's those cell walls that our body can't completely break down to get all the calories. Conversely, we know that if you eat fried foods and if you eat refined sugar foods, we actually absorb a good amount, like close to 100% of the estimated calories. So again, it's switching those dietary choices. I use this in reverse for weight gain clients, right? I'm like, don't eat the nuts and stuff. I want you to eat the nut butter. I want you to absorb as many calories as possible. But again, there's not tons of research, but what I can extrapolate from this is if you eat those whole foods and you eat a primarily whole food diet, higher fiber, chances are you're going to automatically cut some of the calories that you absorb than if you eat some of those, you try to incorporate tons of the other food in there. So again, use all your tools in your toolbox: calories, macros, portions, calories absorbed, talking about different types of foods, trying to transition them into better foods. Preload, you can give filling appetizers, and that's fruits, vegetables, soups. That helps fill people up so they eat less at mealtime. Also, recent research shows that a protein preload helps people eat less at that meal. Visual cues and environment, great research on this: smaller plates, smaller portions, leaving the food on the stove versus putting it on the table, putting it out of sight. So I always, put it high up or very low, just like a store, right? They want you to buy what's at eye level. Put it behind closed doors, because I know many people probably work with families. They have kids, they munch on their kids' foods. Put it out of sight. Company they keep, this is very big, all of you probably know this, but people who eat with overweight people are more likely to eat more than those who have better habits. That's a tough one to change. And then non-hunger factors. My favorite tracking is actually a written journal where they do what they ate. Sometimes I'll have them do calories, sometimes I don't. Just write down what you ate, approximate portions. How hungry they were on a 1 to 10 scale, so they get used to those hunger cues. And then in the third column, why you ate. What did you feel at that time? Were you bored? Were you tired? Were you mad? Were you frustrated? Did you get a bad grade on a test? So they start to look at these patterns, and then we talk about some of those coping strategies that are not related to food. So most important overlooked factor, people get stuck, okay? This is, goes along with that hunger journal. People get stuck with life factors, and I firmly believe this is why they remain overweight or obese. Or some of the people in The Biggest Loser, why did they gain all of that weight back? I remember when I was in grad school, I had to call overweight women for diet records, and here I am on the phone going, man, I just want to graduate. Like, just give me your diet record, right? This, these papers depend on it. And I would hear everything about divorces, kids, money, job, hated my job. All of these factors that have nothing to do with nutrition, right? And as personal trainers, I know you talk to your clients about this, and you have to, and I think it's imperative to send them to a professional if need be, whether it's a life coach or psychologist or counselor, to help them deal with those factors, because until they do, I don't think weight loss is going to be permanently successful if they use food as a coping strategy. And I see it time and time again. So sweeteners, I'm going to quickly run through some of these other slides. Many people asked about artificial sweeteners. Are they bad? Do they cause cancer? They do not in the amount used. They do not. The weight loss results are mixed. They may decrease hunger. The intervention studies actually show that if you drink an artificially sweetened drink versus water, you're actually going to feel a little bit more satiated, and you can actually lose weight. They do have a role in weight maintenance and enhanced weight loss over time in overweight and obese people. The problem is that Diet Coke trade-off. Oh, drank a Diet Coke, I can have a full thing of fries, right? So it's all of these factors, you're going to hear this throughout this talk, all these factors that influence food intake that have nothing to do with hunger. Makes the satiety research difficult. Does the type of food matter, low fat versus full fat? People will say, oh, full fat, you get satiated. You really don't. Protein's the most satiating, most filling macronutrient. That's the one that keeps us full for hours. Interestingly, even if protein keeps us full, and the recommendation is at least 30 grams, 25 to 30 grams a meal for greater satiety, people don't automatically cut their food intake over time. Why is that? Again, it's some of those behavioral things. It's, oh, I want to eat more. So the low-fat, full-fat debate, the other thing about full fat is it does increase, it's palatable. People like, they feel better about eating it. They crave that palatability. Some people do. So in that way, it feels good. I don't think that either one is necessarily, I don't think full fat's better for weight loss. Again, going back to that metabolic ward study, we know that if you cut fat, you can still exercise intensely if you have the carbohydrates, and you'll lose more weight if you cut fat. For health, it's interesting. Depends on the type of fat. Depends on the package of components in the food. So and when it comes to saturated fat, each and every single one is different. Again, it's the whole complete package of the food, and the replacement strategy matters. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Interesting research on dairy. Cheese and dairy is one of the most filling, it's one of the most satiating filling foods for some reason. But cheese, very minor impact on cholesterol. Yogurt, minor if it has some of those probiotics in it, those active and live cultures. And again, the replacement strategy matters. Butter's not back. Liquid oils are always better. The problem is what happened over the past several years, people didn't cut their saturated fat, yet they increased their intake of refined carbohydrates. If you take high-fat foods, replace them with snack wells, your cholesterol, your triglycerides still going to go up, not good for heart health. So that's the bottom line on that. Meals versus snacks, I'll quickly cover this. Brad Schoenfeld's covering it tomorrow. I firmly believe in sticking with a person's normal pattern and just changing their food intake. The research shows that more frequent meals throughout the day, you will feel a little bit more full or satisfied. It does not, you could eat 2 meals a day, 6 meals a day, doesn't matter for weight loss. But you have to meet your protein needs. As Joey said to me last night, he goes, it's really hard to meet protein needs in 2 meals a day for bigger guys. Fasted exercise, I'll cover this briefly too because Brad's going over it tomorrow, but here's the theory behind it. No food, lower blood sugar, lower insulin. That's that storage hormone, right? We know that insulin temporarily blocks the breakdown of fat, helps our body store fat. The funny thing is, if you eat carbohydrate before exercise, you're not sitting there storing fat. You're using it during exercise, right? But if you exercise on an empty stomach, you'll use more fat as a percent of calories. We know this. You probably won't burn as many calories because you can't engage in the high-intensity exercise. Higher fat or not enough carbohydrate on board, your body can't access fat quickly enough as a source of energy to sustain high-intensity exercise. So I like people, if possible, to have some carbohydrate if it's realistic for them. I've had people that they just don't eat breakfast, and I'm just not going to change that, so I don't. I might have them take branched-chain amino acids in the morning, and then for my football players, after running, they eat something before they lift, and that's our strategy. So again, keeping with their normal diet patterns. 5 minutes, okay. So maximizing weight loss, coach about metabolic adaptation. Let them know this is coming. You're not going to need as many calories to walk around with a 250-pound body as you will a 300-pound body. Food choices, I always say coach on food choices as much as possible. Try to get them to try new foods, change their what they like, minimize excuses, and then talk about those lifestyle factors. Weight gain, I'm going to quickly go through this because Joey's going through this next. But again, you'll have that metabolic adaptation. There are some people we know from the research that it almost doesn't matter what they eat, right? With this, one of my football players, I just put him on a higher calorie diet. He'll meet his protein needs. You're eating 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day. There's no way you're not meeting your protein needs, right? And again, genetic predisposition. We almost had to stop him at 243, I think. Calorie-dense foods, easiest way. When worse comes to worse, sometimes I add Haagen-Dazs or other very high. When you've got athletes over 6,000 calories, it's hard to eat that much food. It's a pain. And have them follow a plan. Supplements. Okay, quickly go through this. How many of you get questions about dietary supplements? All right, so starting with multivitamins. I love the media articles that are like, oh my gosh, they don't prevent or cure disease. They're not intended to prevent or cure disease. That's the craziest thing ever. Here's what multivitamins are supposed to do. Here are, according to N. Haynes research, which is the best we have, Americans in general are low on all of these. People who diet and women have the lowest intake of all of these nutrients. Vitamin D, vitamin E, magnesium, we know that we need that for energy, right? Calcium, vitamin A, vitamin C, zinc. We're low on nutrients. We have a nutrient-poor diet. That's what a multivitamin does. It fills in those gaps. The issue with multivitamins is the kinds in the grocery store, the regular kinds, they tend to have less absorbable forms of minerals, and minerals compete with each other. So that's where, I'm torn when I recommend something. It's tough to go in a grocery store and go, okay, get the $8 bottle of, generic multivitamin. You'll get your vitamins. Minerals you're not going to get much of. You're going to get those less absorbable forms. And I can recommend some brands after if people want them. Heart health. I hear this all the time. Oh, you need this ratio of omega-3s. Who sits there and looks at their diet and goes, oh, okay, I've had a 4-to-1 ratio today. I've done pretty well. Oh, I had a 2-to-1 ratio. Nobody does that, right? Omega-6s are not all inflammatory. They're anti-inflammatory and they're inflammatory. Omega-3s in general, anti-inflammatory. We know far less about ALA, that's flax seeds, chia, etc. For all the vegans, we know it's heart healthy. They don't know if it's because of the ALA, the alpha-linoleic acid, or if it's the food matrix. Is it just walnuts? We know walnuts are healthy. Is that why it's heart healthy? EPA and DHA, those fatty acids in fish and some algae, I'm a huge fan. They decrease triglycerides in a dose-dependent manner, those blood fats. They decrease blood pressure. Emerging role in brain health, especially, we know it for little kids. They're looking at it now for Alzheimer's and post-concussion, et cetera. Also very important for cell wall flexibility. We need that. We need flexible cell walls so receptors can bind. Very important. The research on muscle, some of the research studies in older adults show that higher doses may help attenuate inflammation in muscle, so they have greater strength. Inflammation, acute or chronic. This is, when it comes to acute inflammation, I try not to tame it. When it comes to that chronic low-grade inflammation, how do we measure it? I don't know that we have a way to measure it. The most interesting thing I ever heard, I was interviewing a researcher a few years ago, and he said, all autoimmune diseases are caused by inflammation. And I said, wait a minute, repeat that. Like, you actually said cause. Every single autoimmune disease, he said, has its root in inflammation. How do we lower it? Stress, diet, supplements. The supplements, it depends on the area of the body, right? For joint health, we know that there are certain things that can lower inflammation in joint tissue. Boswellis serrata, glucosamine chondroitin help rebuild the matrix a little bit. Muscle, ginger, you have to take it over time from what we know. Tart cherries, raspberries, and caffeine. Curcumin is a huge one. Huge popular supplement. I get this question all the time. They're like, can I just add turmeric to my food? Curcumin's a constituent of the spice turmeric. You'd have to add bottles of it. You need a minimum of 1,000 milligrams to 1,500 milligrams. It may help with osteoarthritis. It's not well absorbed at all. So a regular supplement's not going to work. You need it with black pepper, which is piperine. And then those other two are actually brand-named ingredients that are basically created to increase absorption. Omega-3s, oh, okay, I got a minute or two. I'm going to quickly go through this. Omega-3s help decrease inflammation. And the biggest thing is, what foods can you cut down on? Saturated fat, fried food, those high sugar foods, we know those increase inflammation, and alcohol. So joint health, I mentioned that. Fat burners, not really a huge fan for how much people pay. It's really not going to make that big of a difference in weight loss. Top 2 changes. Can anyone guess what these are? Tracking's a good one. Actually, the first one is hydration. And at least 50% of the people that I test are dehydrated on an everyday single basis. And the research shows that sweat losses of just 1 to 2%. So this isn't starting in a dehydrated state. This is starting in a hydrated state and then losing water weight through sweat. Impaired short-term memory, your reaction time, you're going to feel grouchy and moody. Higher sweat losses, fatigue, decreased motivation, decreased strength, decreased power. When we look at sports-specific, some of the research, there's not tons of research in different sports, but I look at basketball. Decreased shot percentage from different areas of the court, decreased vertical jump. So we know it affects every factor. And like I said, This is when you start in a euhydrated state and then decrease. Imagine your clients that come in at 6 a.m. Are they hydrated? 50% or so probably are not. The best way to tell, I don't really go by the urine color chart because there's so many factors that influence urine color, from the drinks that you consume, beans, different ingredients, medications. I just tell them you need to go to the bathroom every couple hours. If you're not peeing every 2 to 3 hours, you're dehydrated. That's easy to remember versus a subjective, I think my urine looks this color. And then inadequate replacement of sodium. This is huge for athletes. There's no indication that high sodium diet causes high blood pressure. There's a varying level of sodium sensitivity. It's 45 to 75% of Americans are sodium sensitive, according to research studies. Just eating sodium is not going to give you high blood pressure. The biggest thing I get is, man, I feel better. They're like, that made such a difference on the field, on the court. You know, every day I think better at work. That's what sodium and replacing fluid do. And then the second one is sleep. I find there's a chronic sleep deprivation going on here in America. And so I always counsel on this because it affects their what they eat. If you're tired, you're going to reach for something, whether it's caffeine or food, to try to increase your energy. Usually I find people reach for sugar. They reach for that quick source of energy, and it impairs mental and physical performance. So quick summary and then questions. Get enough good quality rest. This is a tough thing for people, but I try to give them, back them down for the time they go to bed, half hour at a time. Stay hydrated. Like I said, at least 50% of the athletes that I test are dehydrated. Some are severely dehydrated. I had one that was so dehydrated, I looked through the medical literature and I couldn't find a value that high. Choose targeted supplements in efficacious doses. I can tell you some of the doses for some of those if you want to know. Change long-term behaviors, but keep those ingrained patterns. I keep meal patterns as much as possible because people, if I go from 3 meals to 6 meals, they just don't stick with it. They tend to go with what they grow up with, whether it's grazing or a certain amount of meals per day. Keep messages easy to understand and follow. Where do you go for more information? And here are some of the things places I recommend. NIH actually has a phenomenal website for certain supplements and then also alternative therapies.